Humdrumity, humdrumity, humdrumity.
Listener, to be young again. But is that to be young again in bygone days? Or would that be to be young again growing up in this day and age? Every generation faces its own challenges and obstacles. Though we can offer advice, those growing up today must find their own ways. Finding worldly knowledge and inspiration, then turning it into tangible action has been the lifelong passion of my guest. Christina Wenman is an author, podcast host, and burgeoning documentarian exploring life as a Gen Z Zoomer in an era fraught with digital trappings. Tune in to find out about the Humdrumity Line being coined on this very episode. All right, we aren't getting any younger, so let's get started. Hi, Christina, and thank you for joining me on Humdrumity today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Okay, well, I always say that an excited guest is the best guest. So where in the world are we finding you today?
How specific you want me to get? Because I'm in a library.
Where, just geographically, where in the world are you today?
Yeah, I am in San Diego.
San Diego, California. Are you enjoying the sunshine down there?
Oh my gosh, I'm loving it. I went for a walk this morning around this library that I'm in, and it's beautiful. So much. I don't want to say it's more beautiful than Wisconsin, where I'm originally from, but it sure is nice being here in the winter when I'm used to the winters in Wisconsin.
Now, it shouldn't be of consequence, but for context, I would like you to tell the listening audience how old you are.
I am 24.
24. So you are certainly the youngest guest I've ever had on the podcast, but this is not without reason. So this ties in very nicely because in my previous episode, Mentorship Demystified, my guest, Dr. Deborah Heiser, introduced the idea that of mentorship coming from anywhere and anybody. Now, specifically, one of the things she mentions is this notion that how older generations really need to learn from younger generations to understand and communicate with them. So why I've brought you on the podcast is I would like to get the perspective of a younger generation and how a younger generation experiences monotony in their lives and how those experiences may inform an older generation, which is mainly my audience, as well. What specifically younger people can do to find enthusiasm and bring meaning into their lives as they embark on their life journey. So before we get into that, what I'd like to do is get a summation of your life, because for someone so young, you certainly have accomplished quite a lot. Now, to begin with, you wrote a book. Can you tell me about your book and when you wrote that book?
Yeah, so I wrote my book. It's funny, I've never considered myself to be much of a writer. Still to this day, don't necessarily consider myself to be a writer, but I was always very curious. And I think to a certain extent, everybody's curious, right? It's just a matter of how much that gets suppressed by society, and we could go on about that. But I was always really curious, especially about success. And I get nervous to tell people that I wrote a book about success because it's like so ironic. Like, what does a 16-year-old know about success? But that's kind of the whole principle of why I actually wrote it, was to not find the answers. Well, not tell people the answers, but to find the questions you almost like need to ask yourself, because success is such a subjective thing to everybody. And so I was like, I want to figure out what success means. And so I went out and I interviewed a bunch of people who were conventionally, quote unquote, successful, and just try to learn from them. And I took those answers in those interviews and kind of compiled them into what are the themes that are popping up, so I could share that with other people in my school, other people my age. And it's interesting because, again, it sounds ironic to say that I wrote a book about success when I was, 16. I ended up publishing it when I was 17. But there are a few main themes that I pulled from these people who had, lived these conventionally successful lives, but one of the biggest things was authenticity. And it's interesting because when you're in high school, you are around everybody trying to figure out, what are you going to do with your life? Where are you going to go to school? Um, and that conversation around success is so prevalent. But really, what kickstarted the book for me was I wanted to figure out kind of why are we chasing after this thing? Because my biggest fear was getting to the end of my life and realizing that everything I put my time, money, and attention toward was, not what I actually wanted.
Then was the impetus for the book more coming out of your own personal concern about, and maybe for lack of a better term, angst about success? Were you at 16 years old concerned already about this idea of needing to find accomplishment, to find success?
Yeah, I think I always, I definitely wanted to, quote unquote, be successful, but I really wanted to understand it a little bit more because I remember there were a few distinct conversations that I had with some of my friends. And again, it's high school, you're trying to figure out where you're going to go to school. You're trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And I had some friends who were, I knew them on a personal level, obviously, because they were friends, but I was like, what, where are you going to go to school? Like, what are you going to do? And I remember one of them had said, oh, I'm going to go to school to become a doctor. And I was like, oh, like, you know, why do you want to go to school to become a doctor? Like this person didn't kind of, didn't seem like they aligned with wanting to be a doctor. And he was like, oh, like that's just like kind of what my parents want me to do. And I was like, well, what would you want to do if you could do anything in the world? Like in everything, I mean, obviously that's a question that people get asked, right? Like if money wasn't an option, what would you want to do? And he was like, and then he went on this whole, long tangent and he was super passionate about wanting to be a teacher. Like he was like, oh, it'd be so cool to be a history teacher. And I was like, why, why are you going to school to become a doctor when this whole time like you want to be a history teacher? And I think having those kinds of conversations with people where I realized that, you know, people are wanting to and it's in everybody, right? Like it's in all of us that we want to quote unquote be successful, but is that definition of success coming from the world or is that definition of success coming from ourselves?
Right. So, having written the book and going through that process, how did that guide you moving forward? Did that shift your mindset at that time? Do you still go back and look and review, what you learned from that experience to help guide you?
Yeah. So what's interesting is looking back on it. So it's been, I wrote it when I was 16. I published it when I was 17. I'm 24 now. So that, it's been a few years. And the thing that's most interesting to me is that, yes, I learned a lot in the content and I shared a lot of the stuff that I learned from the conversations. But I think I learned probably 10 times, if not more, from the actual process of writing the book. And then also in hindsight, kind of reflecting on the book. So, one thing, going into writing the book, I was like, if I can just figure out what these people would have said to their younger self and then just follow that advice, then I'll be able to have a fulfilling life and be successful and all this stuff. But what I realized through that process is, um, I learned what they wanted to tell their younger self. I took that. But what's interesting about knowledge is like, okay, you can have that conscious level of understanding and you can have somebody tell you, hey, this is what I wish I would have done. But a huge part of, actually learning that stuff is going through those experiences on your own. And so again, like I learned a ton from what the people had to say, but looking back on it, I think I learned so much more from going through some of those experiences on my own, and then also um, even during writing the book, some of the interactions that I had with people that didn't actually come out in the content of the book.
Mm, mm. So, you mentioned about the main takeaway that you had from the book was this idea of authenticity. Can you discuss that a little bit more and sort of define what that means to you and what that should mean to others?
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. Authenticity can kind of be a little bit of an overused word, so it's a little tricky, um, or a little bit cliche. But yeah, I think one thing that I found, and this kind of ties back into the example of when I was with my friend and they wanted to become a doctor, but it was only because their parents kind of wanted to become a doctor. It's a very common experience that you hear people talking about. Um, and I think when I had interviewed the people, both when I would interview the people, they expressed that authenticity was important and doing what they actually wanted, not just what the world wanted of them, because that's what actually made their experience fulfilling. But then on a process side, like a time where I had to actually learn authenticity, and I don't talk about this experience a lot just because I try to be um, conscious of kind of what I do share, but I had an experience that taught me a lot about authenticity that I didn't actually write in the book. And that was one of the people who I interviewed. His name's not in the book, but it was somebody who I looked up to quite a bit. I watched a TED talk that he did, and I was like, this is who this is who I want to interview. And I reached out to him, didn't think he was going to respond, but he actually ended up responding to me. I was so excited because this was like somebody I looked up to a crazy amount. And we had a really good conversation, and he was he basically offered to kind of take me under his wing and say, "Hey, like, I want to take you under my wing. I want you to follow in my steps because I can guarantee that I can make you a millionaire by the time you're 22 or something like that." And at the time, it was really hard because I had been looking up to this person, and he had just basically offered to be a mentor to me. I was like, of course I'm gonna want to do that, right? But then there started to be some of these red flags that popped up, and I was like, do I want to follow this person's footsteps, or you know do I kind of continue on and do my own thing? um Ultimately, obviously didn't end up going under that mentorship opportunity, but it kind of just shows you, like, there's going to be those times in life where you get offered what you think is a really great opportunity, but you kind of have to listen to your gut and go with. I mean, mentorship is great. Following people's advice is amazing. Um, but there's also those times when you have those little gut instincts of, is this really true to who I am, or is this just what I think is, quote unquote, successful? And that was definitely one of those experiences for me that taught me authenticity.
So you have, beside you published the book, and then as a result of that, that led you to start your podcast, which is entitled Learning from Your World. Can you talk specifically about, what were your goals of starting the podcast, and, what who were you trying to target as an audience with your podcast?
Yeah. So, what's interesting, I actually wanted to start a podcast for a while after I had written the book, but I didn't know what I wanted to have it be about, because when you start a podcast, and really when you do a lot of things, one of the biggest pieces of advice that people give you is to niche down. And I, it's funny because we talk about authenticity, and actually one of the earlier guests that I had on, we talked about authenticity, and um, this was before I started the podcast. I talked to him about it because I was like, I really want to have this podcast, but I just want to interview a wide variety of people and talk about like life and psychology and business. And I was like, but it doesn't feel niche enough, because people, again, the best practice, make sure it's even more specific. He was like, who says you have to niche down? And I was like, well, everybody on the internet who says if you want to start a podcast and have it be successful. Ironic because it brings back the whole idea of success. Like, if you want to start a podcast and have it be successful, you have to niche down. And he was like, well, that's kind of coming back at me after I learned all. And this is another example of some of the stuff that I learned after writing the book, was kind of reflecting on it. Like, I learned that authenticity was important, but he kind of challenged me in that conversation of saying, you know well, if you want to do it and have more of a broad topic, like just talk about life and business and things like that, who's to say that you can't, right? And again, because authenticity is such a big part of success, is it really a successful podcast if you're not doing what's authentic to you? So it's kind of like one of those, it's kind of one of those like flip it on its head kind of moments of, you're right. Like, who's to say that a successful
Mm.
podcast has to be niched because niching down wasn't authentic to me? So I started out, I had interviewed people on different topics like authenticity and storytelling and personal growth and development and things like that. But what is interesting, and I'm actually glad that I didn't niche down because I started out super broad, and that actually allowed me to find these themes that started popping up naturally. I would say about 4 months ago, I started to realize that these primarily two themes were popping up. One of the themes was the power of connection,
Mm.
and then one of the themes was courage. And whether I was talking to a business owner who basically explained how she quit her job and started this new charcuterie board company that was conventionally, incredibly successful, it was taking off, but she almost quit because she realized that success meant nothing without that connection. So again, whether I was talking to her or whether I was talking to a therapist, like these themes started popping up. So it's funny. I kind of started the podcast with broad ideas in mind, and then started to niche down. Not necessarily niche down in the sense of I'm asking questions about that and making the podcast all about connection and courage, but I have been able to kind of see what are some of the things that are popping up in everybody's stories.
Now, one of the things I do know from your podcast is you end your podcast with a challenge. You ask your guest to provide your listeners with a weekly challenge. What was the inspiration for that? And have you heard feedback on those challenges? And has that inspired you to embark upon those challenges?
Yeah, like, that's a great question because I have always really, I've been a self-help slash psychology, like books, like I was a big over consumer of information. And when you read a lot of books, and actually, I don't think I really read a book until I was like a full book until I was 15. But then after that, because I didn't realize that I liked reading because I was always reading the wrong books. I was reading the ones that the teachers told me about, and I was like, I don't want to read this. So, but then I got really into it, and I really, I was reading a lot of books. I was watching a lot of TED Talks. I was listening to a lot of podcasts. And when you consume information like that, especially when it's nonfiction, you almost get this sense of feeling like you've done something. It's almost like a false sense of accomplishment because you kind of get that feeling of you're like, oh, I never thought about this before. Um, and I started to get kind of hyper fixated on consuming information, but then wasn't actually doing anything about it. So I wanted to make sure that when I created the podcast and brought on these people, that it wasn't just another way for people to consume knowledge, but actually take that knowledge and just really turn it into, you know, what is something that I can do today that is actually reflecting this conversation. So and that was kind of like my little twist on. I know people have their own little thing that they do for their podcast, but that was kind of my twist on it. And what I love about doing the challenge, and I've gotten a lot of really great feedback on it as well, is that it's something that people can do in that moment. Like there's almost no excuse of why you can't take action on the podcast.
Yeah, that's something I strive for when I'm speaking with my guests is this idea of practical advice, right? So getting these small challenges are something that's very practical that you can enact immediately that can help you, change your life, just change your routine, make a difference. It's interesting you mentioned though, somewhat ironically, you don't have to make big changes in your life to make differences, but you did make a very big change in your life. As you mentioned, you grew up in near Milwaukee, um, and then now you packed up, moved to San Diego, where we find you today, and are working on a project, which I would definitely want to, I want to discuss that. But also, this ties back into this idea that you talked about, which is courage. How much courage did it take for you personally to decide to make this move? And was it something that was a sure thing before you lined it up, or was this somewhat of a leap of faith?
I think it was definitely a leap of faith. I mean, as far as coming out here, one thing that is interesting about courage that I've learned though, and I learned this, I would say actually in 2023, uh, when if you don't mind, I'm going to go back a couple years because
Sure.
I think I learned that, again, before I always thought that courage was like just taking the leap of faith and doing these big things. And, I'll be the first to say, well, I mean, maybe there's other people to say it, but like even after leaving my job and moving across the country to kind of work on this project, like I don't think that that is like, yes, that's like a big leap of faith and all this stuff, but like I don't think that that's necessarily always the most courageous thing to do. And I'll go back a couple of years. It was 2022, and I made a yearly bucket list. And one of those things that I put on my bucket list was to do 52 things that year that scared me. And the reason why I did this and I put it on my bucket list was because everybody always talks about getting comfortable being uncomfortable. I was like, okay, well, what does that really mean, right? To get comfortable being uncomfortable. And for a lot of us, regardless, discomfort is inevitable in our life. Like it's going to come whether you choose to seek it out or not. But there's a big difference between seeking out the discomfort and waiting for it to happen to you. And I wanted to kind of put it to the test of like, is there a way that I can systemize this in my life and, create a way to actually get comfortable being uncomfortable. So I did one thing a week that scared me. I called it my weekly fear task. And it wouldn't have ever have to be this crazy big thing, but it could be something as simple as, I hate getting my blood drawn, going and getting my blood drawn. Or, I hadn't flown on a plane by myself before that year. I went and flew the plane by myself. And I kind of reframed it as like, I'm choosing to do these things that are a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And I'm not normally a person to say, like, oh, once I started doing this, everything changed. But it is interesting because this is the one thing that I will say that about. And it was about 3 months in that I started to notice that I don't even like saying getting comfortable being uncomfortable because I think it's kind of sounds cliche, but like I started to notice one of three things. The first thing I noticed was that I wouldn't get nervous up until I wouldn't get nervous until I was actually supposed to be nervous. Whereas before I would be really nervous like the week leading up to something and feeling anxious about doing that thing the week leading up to it. Um, but I started to notice that that nerve didn't kick in until I actually was doing the thing. The other thing that I noticed was I was actually starting to experience excitement instead of anxiety or worry or fear, which was kind of cool because these things, like for example, interviews, right, in the beginning were super scary, super fearful. It wasn't, I was nervous. I knew it was important, but I didn't see it. I wasn't excited. And now I get so excited for interviews, like interviewing people for my podcast. I don't even have the nerves. It's excitement. And then the third thing that would happen, I noticed, was I didn't have an emotional like reaction to it at all, like a physiological response to it at all. And these would be things that used to, make me incredibly nervous. And so I think through that process, and I continued it, and I still try to continue it to this day, but I started to realize just that courage and doing these things, it just builds on each other. It's about building the habit of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, um, and not doing the big spontaneous things. And so now I'm trying to continue that throughout, but I don't think I would have been able to pack up and fly out here to work on this project and leave my job if I hadn't had that base of just slowly doing a little bit more, doing those things and challenging myself every week.
Yeah. So you basically, habitualized this idea of overcoming, fears, anxiety, finding courage. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I can't come up with 52 things in my mind of that I need to overcome. How did you come about creating that list?
Yeah, so I actually kind of did it as I went along. And if anybody does this and chooses to like put this into their life, I would actually recommend not doing it any more than like 3 months out or like even a month out. Um, because things that you might think are scary at the beginning of when you do it, like at the beginning of the year, are going to be the same things that maybe aren't scary at the end of the year. So I didn't do it all at once. I kind of took it as, okay, what do I have on my, what do I already have to do? And what could I do right now? I played it out and just always had it at the forefront of my mind of, what things could I choose to do? So, like I said, I wanted to start the podcast. I don't know if I would have started the podcast officially or if it would have been delayed if I hadn't done this because it was kind of an excuse to check off doing a lot of the things, especially in the beginning, setting up interviews, doing like, yeah, scheduling interviews, having interviews, like making posts, like just like those little things that take a lot. I mean, I think they took a lot of courage to be able to do. And that was, so that was a big piece of it is like just developing the podcast. I could break down those into a bunch of little ones. So I kind of planned out about a month, anywhere from like a week to a month in advance, and then would just always make sure it was on my calendar to check off like my weekly fear test.
Yeah, I think that's really some great advice is that the list is creating it more as a living organic list. That, as you say, as you go through these events, that list is going to change, is going to morph. New things are going to come up. So, yeah, trying to do 52 things and list 52 things in one time is not the means to go ahead with that. It's to, again, bringing this back where we talked about challenges, is habitualizing these things. So the list itself becomes another habit for you.
One thing I will say too is it doesn't have to be, when you think about doing 52 things that scare you, it doesn't have to be things that terrify you, right? Like if you're terrified of spiders, you don't have to do, you don't have to do exposure therapy every week. But I kind of laid out a framework for it, which is like from 0 to 10, like 10 being things that like really scare me to 0 being things that like I can't put on the list because they don't scare me at all. And I would try to find like that sweet spot of anywhere between like 4 to 6 and being very conscious of like, okay, because you could get, if you were to do exposure therapy every week with things that were a 10, like could be traumatizing. So finding that sweet spot of what's something that still gives me the reward of once I accomplish it or once I do it, I feel like I did accomplish something, but not so much to the extent where you're like traumatizing yourself every week.
Let's just turn back and discuss more about this project that led you to pack up, go across the country, and you're now in California working on this documentary. What was the genesis of that documentary? I believe you're working with other people on this documentary. How did it come about?
Yeah, so I was already kind of looking into a lot of mental health stuff for Gen Z, and I was doing a lot of research, and I actually came across this Kickstarter page on Google, and it was like mental health Gen Z documentary. And I was like, what is this? And so I checked it out. And I actually have always wanted to kind of just work on a documentary. I've always been interested in them in the same way that I wanted to write a book. It wasn't because I am a film person, but it was really because I was passionate about that specific topic. And I looked into it and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to send her a message, the executive producer. And so I sent her an email, which I'm so glad that I sent her the email the same day, because if I didn't send her the email the same day, I don't think I would have ever done it right. I needed to have that momentum of like, when I saw it, I sent her an email. I was like, hey, I saw you were working on this documentary. I'd love to learn more. Do you need any help? I was like, I'm in Wisconsin. She was like, all of our team's based in San Diego. We're doing most of the filming out here. So you could help with certain things, but it would be a lot, easier if you were in person. And she wasn't asking me to, pick up and go there because it's not like a separate job, right? It's just a passion project. But I kind of thought about it and I was like, you know, I kind of want to go all in. I feel super passionate about the topic of, mental health, especially in Gen Z. I mean, mental health all the way around, but especially with how disconnected our world is. And like, I want to make this good. And it's just a group of, young of, Gen Zers, trying to make this film about how we can, what's the root of the mental health crisis, and then also how we can ultimately come to fix it.
And that transitions perfectly into the main theme of I'm hoping to uncover with our discussion today, which is this idea of Gen Z having to deal with monotony, with boredom, tedium. Do you feel that there is any influence on those particular feelings that is leading to this crisis with Gen Z? Do you feel that that is specific to Gen Z that may not have been experienced by other generations? And what specifically can Gen Z do to start bringing themselves out of that crisis and, enjoying a more fulfilling life?
Yeah. And, when it comes to the generations, I don't think it's fair to compare and say, one generation experiences something worse or better than the other generation. But I do think it's interesting to kind of look into what plays a role in why generations are different, right? Like, especially comparing, somebody who went through the Great Depression or wars, like to compare that to technology. It's like you can't compare those two things from like a oh, we have it worse because we have technology. Oh, like those are very, I would never want to, I mean, not to say I would never want to be in a different generation, but like, I do think it's important to come at this conversation from like a very neutral lens of like, what is different specifically? And I think one thing that is different, obviously growing up with technology, like you do see everybody else kind of going out and living their lives and doing all of their things that does make it a little bit different. And I think, I've talked to a lot of my friends as well about this. And I think the monotony piece of what's different about Gen Z is you have constant access and comparing, you're kind of always comparing what you're doing to not only other people's highlight reels, everybody talks about that, but, now if you have, say, 1,000 friends on social media or whatever it is, like you're comparing your everyday life to however like if before I only had 5 friends that I was kind of in a close circle with, I knew what was going on, but now you have all of that. And so I think when it comes to you know getting in like getting into monotony and having that kind of tedious, like feeling like you're bored or whatever, like the bar is set so much higher for our generation because we're constantly comparing what we've got going on to people in that sense. Should I be doing new things every week? Should I be, doing this and that? So I definitely do think that we experience it, but I think the thing that might be different is that technology component of being able to see and social media component of being able to see what everybody else has got going on. Um, and I'm not going to say that social media is bad or good, again, in the same way that I'm not going to say that we have it worse or better than any other generation. But I do think that it plays a role and impacts kind of where the bar is of what monotony is kind of defined as.
Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody experiences boredom throughout their life, and that is one of the key components of life is how do we deal with boredom or how we can actually sometimes leverage boredom to investigate ourselves, to go, be more self-reflective. But back to what you're talking about with, specifically with Gen Z, the digital age has existed for, even my generation, Gen X. We're, the generation that first sort of transition from traditional media, being television, radio, that into the digital era. But social media hasn't been as influential in people's lives until really Gen Z came along. And as you say, there's these people living their life through social media, but we all know that social media isn't truth. There's you see these influencers, oh, they're leading their fantastic lives. We also find out about, hang on, so and so wasn't actually in Aruba. That's all fake. That they fake that, right? Or
Wait,
their
did they
life is
fake
actually,
that being in Aruba?
yeah, you can fake it.
You can fake it? Why
Yeah,
would
you
you do?
won't,
I mean, I understand, but like,
because you want people to think that your life is amazing. And so
yeah,
there's this sort of, you know, generation of false success, false happiness, false experiences that Gen Z may be somewhat victim to, which leads their life, their self-assessment of their life in these unrealistic, um, to these unrealistic goals that are being presented to them.
yeah, and I think that's why connection, like real connection, is so important because when you do talk to people and you talk to friends and you like even just having these conversations about like, oh, I'm feeling, you know, like I'm experiencing monotony in my life, or oh, I'm feeling like I don't have a lot going on. And when we open up to people, and because humans are wired for reciprocity, and like when we are vulnerable and become connected with somebody else, they show us that. And so we're able to, it's almost a way to like get a readjustment of reality when we have that realistic connection because you can't get that reality through social media, and you can't even get that reality through knowledge. Like I think about when people will say they go to their therapist and then their therapist is like, oh well, I have so many clients that experience the same thing that you're going through, but it doesn't have the same effect as when you open up to a friend and say, hey, this is what I'm feeling, this is how, like, what I'm going through, and then your friend says, no way, I'm feeling the same way. Like no matter what statistics and numbers or whatever your therapist tells you about how they're they have so many clients that say that they're experiencing the same thing, that's not human, right? But what is human and what is so, like, what is that real connection is being able to have that conversation with a friend. So again, I'm not going to say that social media is bad. I think social media is a vessel for that, and I think you can still have real connection through social media, a different kind of connection.
And just equally as important, and I do agree with you that social media definitely has its pros, right? But it's our ability to assess. It's even coming down to this idea of um, media literacy. And this becomes a bigger and bigger skill that people need to acquire is being able to assess what they're being presented, whether that be through news, right? Whether that be through social media, but it's this ingestion of information. And we need to be able to have the ability to assess that and see it for its reality. But going back to what you say about connection, that is, I think, becoming more and more of a kind of common theme throughout the world because we went through COVID, right? And, that's the other thing about Gen Z is, they were probably the generation that lost the most out of COVID because they had those years of isolation, those very important years when you are developing connections, you were isolated at home. I already mentioned in my last episode about with Dr. Deborah Heiser, what she also mentioned is this new thing called social prescribing. And what this is it comes out of England and it's now apparently becoming bigger in the United States, in North America, where your doctor will actually prescribe to you social interaction.
Yeah, and there's a meta-analysis that's called the connection prescription. And it goes through like all of the past studies that have shown like physically how critical connection is for your health. And I think we almost need to be prescribed it in a way because like it feels a lot more tangible. Like we want to, there's a reason why it's easy to take a pill and it's easy to take things that are prescribed to you. I don't think, you don't, it's hard to see the full value in something until it's, you know, you see the research and, are prescribed. And so I love um, that theme and that idea of social prescribing and that it's becoming a lot more common now too.
Yeah, and I would even say that your courage challenges
Yeah.
is another great example of that's almost like a prescription, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So, it does sound like you've lived a pretty fulfilling life, I would say, based
Oh,
on
thank
your
you.
achievements. Um, but, you've completed these major projects and milestones. But have you ever found yourself asking, like, what's next? And has that question been, you know, a large hill for you to climb and seem daunting?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, and interesting how you kind of bring that up too, because in a weird, like, ironic way, I feel like the more that quote unquote do, and I think that's a subjective thing to say that somebody obviously has a fulfilling life, but like, or like having done a lot of things, but I think the more that you do, it kind of makes other things seem less than, right? Like, you almost when you raise your bar of the things that you've done, you do more things, like the less sensitive I think you, or the more, yeah, the less sensitive you are to what monotony, quote unquote, looks like.
No, and it makes sense. What you're saying is the more you achieve, the more exciting things you experience, that the baseline for what I would call humdrumity is higher because it's if you're not doing those more exciting things, it's much easier to fall below the humdrumity line, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that you, yeah. I like that you call it the humdrumity line. I think that's very true. Both from yourself, and then also like when you have those comparisons to like what other people are, what's going on in other people's lives, like it raises that line of that humdrumity line.
The humdrumity line, coined right here today. Um, so as somebody who said that the first books you started reading at 15 were self-help books, which is, I'm sure, an interesting discussion in itself. But and somebody who then wrote a book, did a podcast, is working on this documentary. Now, you're obviously working with some peers on this documentary, but do you consider yourself an average representative of Gen Z? Or do you feel perhaps maybe more like an outside observer of your generation?
I definitely resonate with the term observer. I wouldn't, I don't really look at it in the sense of like I am average, or like a linear sense of like whether I'm in the average Gen Z. Like, I struggle with that question a little bit. I do definitely think I'm an observer of the generation. I mean, I would say I have kind of an old soul. Um, but also I think there's a lot of other people in my generation too, that are old souls. There's a lot of people who are on, all ends of the spectrum. So I think it's hard to answer whether I'm average or not within my generation, but I definitely would say an observer of my generation.
Right. Now, not to put you into a spot here, but do you consider yourself or have you ever been called an overachiever?
I have been called an overachiever. Okay, but the thing is, like, I do think, and I don't know if it would be called like a trier. I actually, one of the people who I interviewed on my podcast, she was like, I'm just a trier. The girl who quit her job and started her charcuterie board business. And I loved it because I think there is this like connotation that comes with the word overachiever or like trier. And I think part of the reason why I have been a trier is because I've always felt with life, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And so I'm like, I'm going to try as hard as I can, not because I'm trying to prove anything, not because I'm trying to, do crazy big things, although that's like kind of fun too. If I ever got to the point where I was doing crazy big things, like that sounds fun. But like, we only have however much time that we have on this earth. Like, I can't even say a guaranteed number. It's like, I'm going to try to put in as much as I possibly can, because that's the way that, the way I see is getting as much out. I mean, there's a difference between that and like getting fully burnt out. Like there's nuance in that. But I want to notice and I want to observe and I want to experience as much as I can on the whole aspect of the spectrum. I don't know if I've ever been called an overachiever, but I would say that I'm a trier, if
You're
that's
a
the same
trier.
thing.
Well, you've achieved a lot. I don't think you should shy away from your achievements. Okay, I want to just tie this up as we finish off here. And this is a question that sort of occurred to me when going through sort of your history. And the term your is actually very what I want to focus on, because I noticed that your book title is Success Through Your Eyes, and your podcast title is Learning from Your World. But the question is, who is your? Is your the people that you spoke to? Is you're the people who are listening? Is, this idea of your as other? Who do you see as your in your titles?
Yeah. So, and it's actually interesting. I want to kind of bring this back to when I started the book. It was actually called Success Through Their Eyes. Before I published it, I was going to call it Success Through Their Eyes. And I was going to interview these people and figure out what success was. So then you could see it through their eyes and then kind of just live their definition of success, which is ironic because then the whole premise of my book was to basically, talk about, especially when you talk about authenticity, it doesn't matter what somebody else's view of success is. You can learn from it. But at the end of the day, something like success is subjective. The whole point is to create that for yourself. So it actually shifted from my book to being about the people who I was interviewing and shifted into the people who were reading the book. And because I realized I was trying to find the answers of success, but what I actually ended up finding through that process was, I actually needed to find the questions that we need to ask ourselves and then give that to the reader. So if you look at my title on my actual book cover, it has Success Through Their Eyes, but then the there is crossed out with an X and then scribbled in your. So that was very intentional. So it's funny that you kind of bring this up. So it really was, especially for the book, it was always about the person reading the book. And then with the podcast, it was, with the Learning from Your World, which actually stemmed from the book's byline. I'm not sure if you saw that. It's Learning from Your World to Find Your Way, Success Through Your Eyes, and then Learning from Your World to Find Your Way. That's kind of what that's what turned into the podcast. And it's the same thing where I'm interviewing these people about things that we can pull from. And I'm kind of learning from my world on the podcast, but I am hoping, with why I'm doing it is I want people to also be inspired to learn from their own worlds. And not even that sounds so cliche, but I don't, I want people to take these conversations and not just listen to them to, get the perspective of the people I'm interviewing, but also to be able to say, oh, I want to start having these conversations. Maybe they heard something in the podcast that they really liked and want to bring up at the dinner table or with their friends. And my goal is for people to ultimately be able to, learn from their own world, whatever that looks like.
I, for one, after interviewing you and spending this time together, look forward to your future endeavors. I wish you luck with this documentary and, whatever other endeavors you hope to challenge yourself with in the future.
Thank you so much. This is great.
Okay. Well, you take care. Have a great day and enjoy that San Diego sunshine.
Amazing. Will do. Thank you so much.
Here we are together again at the end, dear listener. I'm going to take inspiration from my guest and pose a challenge to you. This week, I would ask that you listen to episode 1, Stop and Notice with Jay Forte, on Christina's podcast, Learning from Your World. But here's the catch. You must listen to it with someone else together. There you go. Courage and connection all rolled into one. Again, follow Humdrumity on your favorite podcast app, like any episodes you've enjoyed, and be sure to spread the word. Until next time, take care.